Hi class, in this video we're going to look at Windows Forms controls and their properties just a little bit more in depth. First of all, I have this piece of code that we looked at in our last video where when our user clicks on the picture box control on our form, picture box 1, that click event will run this line of code. In our code, we said that we wanted to change the visible property of our label 1 control to true. So then we saw that we could see that label on the form because we made it visible. When we look at this code, let's break it down a little bit. We started out with the name of the control, our label that we had placed on the form. We left it the default name of label 1. Then we have the property of the control that we're concerned with, and that property is a class field that's available to that control. The two of those pieces combined create the property identifier. The identifier for a property on a form control is multi-part. The control name and the property name are combined, and they're separated by a dot. So that dot is important. It indicates that we're looking for a subcomponent of a component. We've seen that in some other C# syntax. Finally, after the equal sign, we have the value of true that we want to set this visible property to. And so we know that our visible property is a Boolean kind of property. Now, looking at it as a further in depth as a Boolean, we could do an if statement checking the value of that visible property of our label. So we could say if the label is visible, make it be false. Otherwise, make it be true. So what we would be doing in this if statement is using that property as a Boolean, checking the property of it. We would, of course, execute our else clause if it were not true, meaning our label was currently invisible, and then we would change the setting of that visible property to be the opposite. So we can toggle it on and off. We'll do that in just a second with our Hello World program. Now that's an example of a Boolean property type. We could also have string or numeric properties on our form. In this code, we create a string variable to hold a value. So we're working to hold the value that was typed by our user. Our string is called save data. Next, we set our save data string equal to the value found in our text box, txt_bx_name, in its text property. Because when we display a text box control to a user, the property that they're entering data into would be the text property. Next, in the third line of, again, we have the name of our control, followed by the property name that we want to update. Next, at the very bottom, we're going to clear that text box for the next entry. So here we're saying we want to update text box name's text property and set it equal to 2 double quotes, which would be an empty string value. So in the middle line of code, we're saving or getting a value from our form property. And in the last line of code, we're setting a property value in a form control. If we want to get a property value, we're usually going to use a variable to save that value. And the variable name is going to end up, of course, on the left side of our equal sign. On the right side of our equal sign, then, we will have that property full name with the control name appended to the property name. For example, if I had a variable named name and I wanted to save the value that was in my text box name.text control on my form, I would have this code here. And if I had a numeric up down, which gives me a numeric value, and I wanted to save the current value to a variable named number, again, my variable name would be before my equal sign, and my form control would be after, because that's the value I want to use. If I wanted to update that value on that form control, I would just flip things around a little bit on that equal sign. So to set a property value, I would use the full name control name dot property name to the left of the equal sign, and then after the equal sign, of course, the value that I would like to set. So form1.text, I could set that text property equal to hello.world. Label1.visible, I could set equal to true or false. So some common naming conventions when we're working with forms in C#. The form controls are things that we add as the developer. We want to name our form controls in a reasonable name, and form control names by convention should be lowercase. Form control names should start with an identifying prefix. For example, FRM for a form, LBL for a label, TXTBX for a text box, BTN for a button, etc. Now these identifying prefixes could vary and could be different depending on your job requirements. We want to always name any sort of form control that's going to be accessed in our code, so we don't really want to see names like label1 or text box 1 in our code. The properties for the controls are predetermined. Whatever capabilities and properties that control has, those are the properties we'll be able to use. They're identified by combining the control name with that property name, so these property names come after that dot. Our property values, again, as we've looked at, can be set and changed during design time of our form or at runtime. So we're going to do part do, that sounds bad, of our Hello World application. Let's bring that back up. Hang on. Getting my application here back to our shape that we left it in. And I'm having to undo quite a bit because I had done a little bit of working with it, like I had told you to do. So you may have to do that also. Now, what I could have done that would be better would be to check this in to TFS. So I'm going to go ahead and check in this version I have from our previous video, and this version, oops, there's an extra item that we did not have. This version of our program, if you remember, displays a picture box and an OK button. And if we click the picture box, our message appears. And if we click the picture box again, our message goes away. If you saw in my form, I had a fragment there of a text box because again I was testing, so I will get rid of this. So now my application is in the shape that it was at the end of the video, and I'm going to go ahead and check that in to TFS. Yes, I want to save all those changes. And my check-in is going to say, Hello World V2 initial check-in. And I'll check that in. Yep. This works out great for me because now I have kind of like a checkpoint, like if I wanted to go back to this version for whatever reason, I could do so easily. So first of all, how do we find our code again? We got this program working and we just kind of shelved it, and I told you to experiment with some things. Well, let's look around and see what we can find. In our Solution Explorer, if we look at our Form 1 and expand it, notice that now our Form1 designer.cs, that code behind file that we were talking about that had that Windows form generated code in it. Remember, if you will, when we looked at this project very early on, there was very little code in that file. Well, now it has a sub entry. I'll expand that, and you can see that we have our form object here is a sub entry. And on our form, we have these different controls, my picture box, a button, and a label. We have some system methods that are available to our form. Dispose and initialize components. Those are those start up and shut down methods that the system set up for us. So we can see that within our designer.cs file, we have a lot more than we did when we looked at it early on. Let's take a look. Lots more. Now the Form1 designer.cs file starts as it did earlier with that dispose method to eliminate excess things when we're done. But now our form generator code and our initialize components method is going to be quite substantially bigger. We're going to see code to instantiate each instance of the controls that we've added to our form. We're going to see additional code to set any properties that we set for any of those controls. This is a special line of code that associates our event handler code, our click event code, with that label. So we'll look at that more in our next chapter. Here's our picture box code, and again we have that click event handler. That's our real code. Remember, our label 1 came from me accidentally double clicking, and our picture box code is where we actually have our code. In our button, we have that one line of code to exit our application. Here is all the code to actually create our button. So again, all of this Windows form generated code we don't need to worry about, but we can do this same kind of thing if we want to. But it is there behind the scenes, and it's working for you. Now what about our code? Well, our code is part of the form1.cs design. And what we can do is view the code by pressing F7 or clicking View Code on a right-click menu or on our Solution Explorer toolbar. Then we're going to see our code that goes along with that form designer generated code. They're all working together to build this form and display it. Here's the code that we left off with. In our button click event, we close out of the application. In our picture box click event, we have a toggle that says if the label is visible, make it invisible. You know, we can do this in a really cool way that's a lot more efficient. Let's try it. We can say instead, we want label1.visible property to be set equal to whatever it is not. How cool is that? So that just creates a toggle. I'm going to comment out this code. And if you remember, I can select the code, and in Visual Studio, I can find the tool in the toolbar that comments out the selected lines. And I want to leave those commented out just as a reminder that there's an alternative to that code. But isn't that nice? We're just setting it to the opposite value, which is exactly what we were doing in this if-else structure. So that's our first change to our application. Let's make sure everything's working properly. I'm going to click my button. There's my label. Click my button. My label disappears. Awesome. Click OK to close it. So everything is working good. I'd like to customize my application a little bit. So I'm going to go back to the form designer, and I'm going to put a text box in to prompt the user for their name. So I'm going to find the text box control. Remember, I'm looking at my toolbox, and my toolbox here in Visual Studio, I have opened the All Windows Forms category so that I could see all of the controls. I'm looking at this text box control, and I want to put a text box on my form. It doesn't need to be super big. Now I'm going to check the properties for my text box. First of all, the text property is empty. That's fine. That's what I would like. In this text box, because I'm going to be working with it in my code, I'm going to name it properly. So remember, again, with my properties sorted alphabetically, I'm going to find that name property at the very top. It's in parentheses so that it'll sort to the top no matter how you have your properties organized. But I want to use that prefix, txt, bx, and then we'll call this name. Now on this text box there are lots of additional properties, and we'll look at a lot of them as time goes on. But again, you're always welcome to experiment. On this name, that's the only property that I really need to change, is the name of the text box itself, where I'm going to put this name. Now I'd like to have a nice helpful label for my user though, so maybe I'll say something like, please enter your name. So let me get a label control, and I'll put it here beside this, and I'll go to its text property and make it display, please enter your name. Now I want to organize that a little bit. Notice as I move it down, I have snap to grid lines that pop up and let me make sure I'm lined up with everything. That looks great. Now, in my code, I want to do something with that name. Sometimes when we're working with event-driven programming, it can be hard to think of which event matters. Well, for our program, we want this form to display in a startup with the world picture and this label that says, please enter your name, in the text box for the user to enter their name. This hello world label will be invisible, so we won't see it. The OK button will be available to close the application. So whenever somebody types their name, their action then would be to click this world button. Let's go to that code. I'm going to double click it. I just clicked twice real slow. Now in our picture box one click event, what I want to do is save whatever information was entered into that text box. I'll create a variable, save name, to hold that data, and I'll set save name equal to our text box name, and I just press tab on that to drop that code into the editor from the IntelliSense suggestion. After I type text box name, I'll type my dot, and again, IntelliSense will start making suggestions. I can type the capital T to move to my text property, and then again press tab or enter to drop that into my code and finish out that line of code. So I've just said I want to take whatever's in the text box name text property and place that value into my save name variable. So now I have that data saved. So instead of just making our label say hello world or hello world, let's make it say something a little more personal. We're going to change our label one text property. And you can tell why we should have renamed our label here. We want our text property to say something different than that hello world. So let's make it say hello, comma, space, and then we're going to add that save name. So now it's going to say hello, comma, your name. Let's do another comma. And after our comma, we'll say how are you today? That should be all that we need to do to make this work. Let's look back at our form designer. I think that it's illogical for the user to type their name over here on the left and then reach over to the right to click this image button. So I'm going to move them, and I want to move both of these controls together. So I can use a rubber band selection. You know, a rubber band selection is where you start at one edge and you click and hold down your mouse button and drag until you've drawn a triangle around the controls. That will select them all. I can move them over to this side of the form, and I'll put my button over on this side. And let's see, I'll put my label down here. Not the best design, but we're working in a test mode here, right? Okay, so let's run it. Now I'm going to put in my name and click the world, and it says, "Hello Renee, how are you today?" Well, that's cool. I think that I should have cleared out my name now. Let's do that. So we found our code, remember, in our click event for our picture box. So I can either click up here on my tabs to go back to my code, form1.cs. Remember, form1.designer.cs is that Windows generated code. My code is form1.cs without the design word. So I'll go back to that code. And after we update our label, well, we'll just do it before, because we'll keep our stuff together. Let's set our text box name equal to nothing. We'll run that. Looking a little better. I'm going to put my name here. Click. Looks great. Now I can say OK. So I think that again, it's still a little awkward. So I'm going to go back to my design. And I think this button, instead of saying OK, should say exit. That maybe makes a little more sense to me. And then we're just ready for our application to work. Run it. Down my name. Click it. My name's cleared out. It's got the message, "Hello Renee, how are you today?" That looks good. I'm going to click exit. So now we've updated our Hello World application to use a form control as an input from our users, and we've seen how we could save that information and use it for later. So this information should be helpful for you in creating your own forms-based application, and I hope you do some experimenting, because with this visual interface, that's the best way to learn. Thank you.